Our panelist is Otito Frances Iwuchukwu. Iwuchukwu. I apologize. I had it right when we did our rehearsal earlier. She's assistant professor at Farleigh Dickinson University, and our topic for the next 30 minutes is equity first instruction. If you're just joining us, just a couple of details. To the left side of your screen, there are two tabs there. Feel free to use the chat tab to communicate with your fellow attendees and to just say hello and let us know where you're from. To the right of that is a tab for questions, and there you can submit your questions for Otito, and I will share them with her, and she'll answer them. And we'll be on this topic of equity first instruction with this focus for the next half an hour. To begin, Otito, could I ask for you to just give us a brief summary of your background and your work?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Otito. As John had said, I'm an assistant professor at FDU, which is Farleigh Dickinson University School of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, and that's located in New Jersey. So my background, I trained as a pharmacist, but then I went into organizational consulting for a few years, then went back to graduate school to get my degree in the life sciences, my PhD, specifically pharmaceutical sciences, and then I started to teach in the School of Pharmacy. At the same time, I'm also finishing my graduate studies in organizational psychology, where I'm looking at organizational power structures and how this influence belongingness and inclusion, right, in an organization. So my interest in equity, I think you probably can see it in me, right? Female, person of color, first generation immigrant. So these things are like very dear to my heart. I went into teaching primarily because I wanted to be that teacher who showed students in my class what was possible. Okay, so I'm very glad to be here, to be able to take any questions that people may have in the area of equity in education, specifically higher education. Thank you.
Thank you, Otito. So here's the first question. As people are thinking specifically about issues of course design, about preparing to teach online, how should they be focusing on equity issues? How can they be equity focused and equity minded as they do design for online courses?
Okay. So it's interesting because, you know, I've been here, I've been looking at some of the questions, and I agree. Like, so with equity, one thing that I want to say first is that equity is not equality, right? So we are now in, and COVID-19 has shown us that even if I started out thinking I'm going to make this one broad canvas for everybody, with the way things are now, we're going to have to pivot. So if you're thinking about a situation, so one key thing now with equity right now would be the situation of internet, right? I see a lot of people bringing that up, saying, what do you do when a person doesn't have internet services? How do you handle that? So if you're designing your course, even though you're designing for an online environment, you have to think about, how do I make sure everyone gets access to this, right? Equitable access. And that may mean you having a synchronous and an asynchronous component to it. So the one thing that I want to say from a faculty perspective is there might be a little bit more work to do, right? But that work comes from a perspective of trying to make sure that all of your students or all of your learners have equitable access, right? But if you think about equity, it's not something that you can really say it's going to be the same for everyone, right? So it's going to be institutional focus, it's going to be region focused, and to some extent, it's going to be your cohort or your population focus, right? So the kind of students you have in your classroom, you're going to have to think about that in great detail. And when you're designing, you need to make sure that everybody can access the materials that you're preparing for your courses.
Thank you. Do you have guidance for instructors who are looking at student learning data and they're concerned about equity gaps or opportunity gaps? So they're noticing as they disaggregate the data from their courses that students from different backgrounds are achieving or performing at different levels in the course. They're interested in implementing specific practices that we know can help to address or remedy those gaps. Do you have some concrete suggestions for those faculty?
For one thing, I would say if you are in an online environment, so you want to be able to have this touch of personal, right? You're not going to just drop your materials there and go away. At some point, your students have to interact with you, right? So that's kind of one of the best practices of online learning, that you have a time when you can do a meet and greet with the students. And at that time, right, you can actually set up sections of those along the way. So if you have like a 15-week session, like we sometimes do, you can do it every 2 weeks or every month, depending on how much time you have. And in that time, you can actually invite, groups of students to meet with you. So you're extending them that personal invitation and you're saying, I want to hear from you. Because I think that the critical thing in higher education is involving the learners, right? Involving them to say, how can you best, right? And I cannot know your needs unless you tell me. I think that's one of the key things that we need to put in mind when we're doing this, right? You want to make sure that you're affording them access to you as an instructor, and you want to make it a bit personalized, right? Obviously, the students don't have to know that you're looking at sections of, students. Like, they don't have to know that you're doing this based on disaggregated data or anything like that. But you want to put that personal touch when you're reaching out to them, because you want to know what they need and how you can best meet those needs.
Thank you. I'm seeing several questions from folks who have students who come from backgrounds where they may have very limited access to Wi-Fi, no access to Wi-Fi. The quality of the technology they have at home may vary quite a bit. They're seeing students accessing their courses on their phones through cell signals. So they want to make sure they're being responsive, that they're being as inclusive as possible, but they're seeing barriers. What suggestions do you have for them?
Okay. For one thing, my key suggestion would be, if your student has a cell phone, right, they do have a bit of access. So the idea will now be for me to think, how can I give them material that they can access via their cell phones? And one way would be probably to chunk it. So then they don't have to watch like an hour-long video. You could section your videos into 10, 15-minute chunks. So that way the student can access it at their own time and they're not having to use up like loads of data. You could also make it not in a huge video format, so to speak, if we're thinking about their access to the data. If possible, when you're recording your lectures, you can turn it into a sort of a podcast format, something that will not use up so much data from the student's perspective, and something that they can listen to on the go. Because one thing that does is it basically also helps you to reach those who are more auditory, right? Because not everyone learns the same way. And in doing that, it also speaks to the question of accessibility in a way, because now they have different modes and formats that they can access the same material.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Several people have said in the questions that they're wondering about students returning to class in the fall. I would say all of our students in one way or another have been impacted by the social movement that's going on around them right now, around Black Lives Matter. They may be directly involved in the protests. They may be witnessing them from a distance and giving thought to them, wondering about them. Students are coming back to classes in the fall in a different state of mind, certainly, than they were, when they left in the spring. And I think some faculty feel prepared to engage with these issues in class, and others feel less prepared, but want to do something and want to make sure they do it well. What suggestions do you have for people about how they enter into that?
Yes, perfect. That is, thank you. That's a very good question. So I want to say, basically, I don't want to use a cliche here, but face it, right? Take the bull by the horns and talk to them about it. So I'll give an example from my own classes. When during the when we transitioned, because we were face to face, we were not traditionally online, and then we transitioned suddenly, and we had to face this. And so, what I did was every 10 minutes, the first 10 minutes of class was really like open mic session. Like, How are you doing? How is everything going? Is everything, are you okay? Right? That was just a question. I want to know if you're okay. And then I tell them too, maybe, today was a rough day. I have children, I'm trying to handle them. So that back and forth conversation opened the way for them to know I'm not just here for you to, take the lectures and go and do whatever you want to do with it. So in that same vein, I'm going to say to anybody who is listening now, and I know there are a lot of people online, don't ignore the elephant in the room. I think that it's something that you can ask people, especially if you have these groups of students in your class, you can bring it up. You can tell them, did they have anything to do with it? What did they think? But you give it a time so you don't take up all your class time, right? You can tell them, okay, for the next 3 weeks, we're going to discuss this in 10 minutes, right? So if anybody's not prepared today, they can prepare for next week, and you keep it, closed. By closed, I mean you don't allow somebody to hijack the conversation. And if they want to do anything or speak to you outside of that closed session, obviously they can reach out to you via email. But in the open closed session in class, you are opening it up to everybody so everyone can have a voice. And there's one thing that I want to say here is sometimes, when we have these open sessions, again, I spoke about somebody not hijacking the conversation. If you really want to hear the opinions of people of color, then you can kindly ask, you can ask the other participants in the session to say, please let us hear from, these people, make it a respectful environment. You set the guidelines or you set the tone for the session. But the idea is that I think people do want to be listened to. I cannot stress that enough. And so if you as the instructor feel like this is something that you want to lean into, you're allowed to do that. But it's not mandatory, right? But it's just leaning into the situation that we have right now, right? So for the people asking the question, if you are really interested in doing that, you do want to make an open forum, right? But a guided open forum of 10, 15 minutes to hear from your students.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I'm seeing some questions come up, and I'm realizing that there are folks who have an interest in this topic for this half-hour segment, but less familiarity with some of the terminology. When we talk about being equity-minded or equity-focused and supporting student success, we're often talking about giving students what they need to be successful. But I think people might need a little bit more elaboration to understand what that means, what that looks like in the classroom, and for folks on this call who are supporting students outside the classroom, what it might mean in their role as well. So could you give maybe a little bit more elaboration on what we mean when we talk about equity first instruction or being equity minded or equity focused, and what that looks like and how we engage our students?
Okay. So equity minded, equity focused. Thank you for that, because those are the standard definitions. If you're equity minded, it means that you are aware, right? You are aware of the barriers or the, racial diversity, economic diversity, or whatever it is, whatever barriers they might be, because we all, depending on where we are, right, we may face different barriers. But whatever those might be, you are aware of them, and you're taking what I call a personalized approach to deal with it within your own sphere, right? So obviously the universities or the systems, they will set systems and structures in place to ensure that everybody has access to the same things, right? So for instance, if you have, I'm trying to think about a situation. So again, if the students were in the class, everybody's going to have access to the materials, right? They're going to have access to Wi-Fi, but now they are no longer in class. They're now at home. There's going to be differences. So you want to be aware of those and then deal with that as best as you can. Like back a few questions back, we had talked about if a student doesn't have a computer, maybe they're accessing it on their phone. The idea is that you as instructor, you need to be aware of that and then take care of it within your classroom, because that is something that the institution can no longer do at that level. It then becomes you as the instructor who has to basically take matters into your hands and say, how do I explore this for my students in this class and make sure that everybody's getting equal access, right, to my materials. But equal access doesn't mean just leaving it on Blackboard and saying, I've done my own part. It's ensuring that you do your part to the extent that everybody in the learning environment has access, right? So the access may no longer be equal because of their infrastructure that they have, but at least you're making sure that whatever infrastructure they have, they are getting access to your materials.
Great, thank you. So let's take that to an even more concrete or practical level. This is a question from a faculty member who's thinking about online synchronous classes. And she's wondering, should it be mandatory for students in an online synchronous class to be connected with their camera on? Should she be flexible with that issue? Is that an equity issue if you're requiring students to have a camera on in a synchronous online space?
Okay, this is another interesting one that even at my institution, we're still, working through it. So now, obviously, we have privacy concerns and we have issues. I don't have any, I'm not going to say this is strictly an equity issue or not, but I look at it from a personalized point of view. If I live in a home that my home environment does not allow me to come on the internet and show my camera for whatever reason, right? I may be logging in from my closet, right? I have a student who has said, she had to go to a neighbor's house to access the computer. I am not going to now. So in that case, the student has gone now from her own house to somebody else's house. You can see how that becomes then an invasion of privacy, not just for the student, but for the person's house that she's, getting internet from. So I, for one, don't mandate it because I know that there are many reasons why a person may not want to have their camera on. And I'm going to ask, the person who asked the question to think about this. If you ask them to put on the camera and the environment is distracting, you are now distracting other learners in the Zoom meeting, right? So it's a two-way street. So it's not just about seeing them. If they come up and the environment is so cluttered and so distracting, you've taken away some access from other people because now they're going to be like, oh, what's going on, right? So I don't think it should be mandated, but I'm not going to also come out and say, hey, this is an equity issue. I just think it's an issue of thinking from the perspective of the student. As long as they're a registered learner, right? They're not like bombing the classroom or anything like that. I think the fact that they indicate their presence, if you're taking some sort of attendance by polling, should be sufficient, right? Except it's a situation where you want them to do some personalized learning. And then in that case, you could split them into breakout rooms so they are no longer distracting every other person. And it may be okay for them to just show themselves with 2 or 3 people.
Great, thank you. Here's a question. This is a follow-up to an earlier point in discussion, but I'm seeing several things about it, so I think this is important to bring up. When faculty members are bringing up issues of race, if they're following up on the social movements that students have been part of, have been witness to over these past several months, how does a faculty member avoid, in the course of leading or facilitating a conversation with students, how do they avoid making students of color feel like they're being asked to speak on behalf of their race or being asked to represent the viewpoint of a whole race? They're aware that they could do that unintentionally. They want to make sure they don't, but what's the way to enter into that so that they avoid creating that situation?
I think the first thing will be setting expectations and essentially having everyone make that disclaimer, right? Because I think when a person says, I'm speaking only for myself and myself alone, it sets the tone, right? So then nobody can come and say, why were you trying to speak for me? So we set the expectations. We say these are the boundaries, right, within which we want to have this conversation. And if you want to go beyond that, you're free to maybe message me and email me. But within the classroom, for the sake of everybody, in order to be inclusive, as it were, we want to set these boundaries, right? And you can ask them to tell you what their preferred boundaries would be, right? If you can see that many times that I've been answering the question, I keep saying you can ask them to tell you, because this is higher ed, right? I believe that, at least except for a very small percentage, everyone who is in higher education is an adult, like legally, they're over 18. And so you want to have their input as much as possible, right? And so if you are thinking, how do I even make them feel included? How do I make them feel welcomed? How do I make them feel like I'm not, this person in the majority trying to dominate the conversation? Again, you can ask them, like, what is the best way for me to approach this that will make you feel comfortable, right? And then hearing from them, you can then decide, right? Almost not democratically, but you can decide as a group or as a team to say, this is the way that we want to proceed with this. So you can see how much work it is already for everybody involved, right? Which is why some people may not necessarily want to go this way, in terms of that's not what we're called to do. That's not, the business of education, but recognize that you are educating a whole person, right? You're not just, it's not in isolation. So if this is a situation or an issue that is important to your students, you may want to take it into consideration.
That's very helpful. I'm seeing a few questions that are asking about the best ways to bring an inclusive approach to the classroom. I know I've heard about some different strategies people use to really get to know their students, to know who their students are, but to do that in a way that is not overly intrusive. It's not invading someone's privacy, but it's demonstrating an authentic interest in connecting with your students as people. Do you have strategies you like to share about how people can do that effectively within the first week or so of a semester, especially given the distance people will feel this fall if many are teaching online or at least partially online?
Mm-hmm. So one of the strategies that I use is basically I ask people to throw in topics, right? What is a topic that is of interest to you? And then, we put it together in a pot. And these questions are brought up, right? They're brought up randomly. And if it's something that is of interest to you, we can have a conversation around that, right? And those people, who are more interested in that, then they can go on and continue to have that conversation. But when I was face to face, one thing that I used to do was to set up like a survey of basically questions that had to do, it was anonymous, but it had to do with, some of the socioeconomic or demographic barriers, right? So how far away from campus do you live? Do you live close by? Do you work? Do you not work, right? So everybody gets to fill in those, gets to fill in the form. And then they are then randomized into groups based on their answers to that, right? And on the basis of that, then you get to meet with people who are a little bit different, right? They have differences now. So you're not forming a homogeneous group, is what I'm trying to say. And then on the basis of that, you can tell them, get to know one another better, right? Because these are all the kinds of differences that you may see in your teams. And so you get to know one another. The other thing that I do that I've found very, very successful is that if I have group projects, if I have more than two, I tell the
Otito, welcome back. Thanks for rejoining. You were right in the middle of a response to a question when you got cut off earlier. And I know a lot of people were interested in hearing the rest of that thought. Could you share it with us?
Yes, thank you. This is inequity in action, right? I got bumped off due to a spotty internet connection, but that's it. I love things like this where you kind of can see what you're talking about. So I was talking about group formation, right? Just talking about how to get students engaged in groups. And I said, I did it face to face, and it's worked online as well. And what I do is I tell the students the first, group project, you can pick your friends, right? Pick whoever you want, or you're free. But then after that, you get randomized, because that is the real world. You cannot, except you have your own company, you don't get to choose who you work with, right? You join a company and you meet a team. And so we're going to go through that randomization process. And what that does is, 50% of the time, right, it gives them the idea that they're in charge. Not an idea, because they are in charge. They choose whoever they want to choose. If I say, just give me 5 people for a group, whoever, I don't, invade that process. I don't come in on that. I just say, give me the names and we'll do that. But then they know that after that, it's going to be scrambled and you get who you get. But then I don't leave them with who you get, right? We go through like a pair, we go through a rubric of grouping. So they will tell me if people, did the tasks that were assigned, and if, the group worked or it didn't work. So that way I'm able to compare these two processes. And I find, that's when you can actually get a bit of information, right, with in terms of team dynamics. And this is just something that I practice in class because I'm very interested in team dynamics, because that is the way that the world works, right? Like I said, except you're a solopreneur, you're going to have to work with people, and you need to get the dynamics, working for you, right? You don't necessarily have to like everybody, get along with everybody, but you need to get the work done. So what are the practices that you need to learn in order to get that done? And I always tell them, I give them, ahead of time. I'm like, this is probably what you're going to see. But then they don't believe me until the end of the semester. And then they come back and they give me everything, like all of the, what you call the kinds of personas. That's what I would say, the kinds of personas that you might see in a group. And I say that's why they tell you that this is a reflection, right, of real life, because you will see these kinds of personas in probably every organization that you work. And I say it's a persona, it's not a person. So don't put it against, that person and then have something with that person. Just realize that this is the way that maybe the person is showing up, and we can manage that, right? We can manage that, but we can't manage it if you don't speak up about it. And so the anonymous review, peer review, does that for us, right? So then I can reach out to the students and say, this is what your colleagues are saying. I didn't say it. This is what they have said anonymously. Let's talk about this, right? And then everybody gets to have their own voice and tell me their own side of the story. But having said that, I'm going to preface by saying that my institution is not, it's a private school, so we don't have that many students. So I don't have the 350 person in a classroom scenario, right? So obviously that may change if you have a much larger classroom. Again, it's contextual.
That's very helpful. I asked Sophia a similar question, and I'll just ask you as we get ready to close up. Do you have any key books, websites, resources you would point people to on the topic of equity first instruction?
So I don't know if this is the book that Sophia was trying to point out. This is a book that I use. I don't know if everyone can see it. Designed for How People Learn. And that recognizes that, people learn differently. So I'm trying to, as best as I can, accommodate that. The other resource that I've used that I really like is something called Manage Memory. It's a book by Patty Shanks. She's a PhD. It's called Manage Memory for Deeper Learning. I tell people I think this was the book that changed my instructional, would I say, mindset, right? Because it really helps you dig down into what is actually needed. Like if I went down to the lowest common denominator, what do I need, or what do the students need? Not I. What do the students need to learn? And once you drill down to it and you get that, then every other thing becomes, an accessory, right, that you can use to finesse the points. Yeah.
Great. So, can you hold up the cover of that book one more time?
It's called Design for How People Learn by Julie Dirksen.
Julie Dirksen. Yeah. Okay. Yes. All right. Well, we are about out of time. I want to thank all of our experts for this afternoon: Brandon, Douglas, Sophia, Otito. There they are. It's been a great session. I want to thank our sponsor, Every Learner Everywhere, for their support of this session. And I want to invite everyone to enjoy the rest of the conference. Everyone's done a wonderful job. The activity in the chat has been so wonderful to see. Sophia, there's your book recommendation, How Learning Works. Thank you so much.
Sorry,
I have that one.
My brain turned off in that moment. I love this book.
Tremendous amount of great sharing here. And, I think with this support and this community, hopefully we'll be doing wonderful things in support of our students come fall. We know there are, tremendous barriers ahead. Hopefully we'll also find that there are tremendous opportunities. And I just appreciate the spirit of collaboration that we're seeing in this event today. Please be sure to explore the event. There's a ton to access, many more valuable resources from our sponsors. Please network with peers. And again, thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day, a good evening. Thanks very much. There'll be a short break for the next half hour.
Bye.
Bye.